In 1969, inside the Kar-Kraft assembly facility in Brighton, Michigan, workers were taking torches and cutting tools to brand new Mustangs. The paradox was physical. Ford Motor Company had built a V8 engine so massive it could not fit down their own assembly lines. To race their new Boss 429 in NASCAR, the homologation rulebook demanded Ford sell 500 units to the public. But the massive aluminum-headed engine, quietly underrated at 375 horsepower for insurance reasons, required widened shock towers, relocated batteries, and a completely outsourced production line just to cram the iron block under the hood. The result was a street car that cost a fortune to build and frustrated dealerships trying to maintain it. Ford had created a masterpiece of high RPM track engineering, yet they were force-feeding it into a street chassis that choked its true potential. The engine could breathe on the high banks of Daytona, but in city traffic, it suffocated. But the real story of the Boss 429 is not only the story of a modified Mustang, it is the story of how an American automaker built a racing engine so uncompromising, it ended up destroying the very world it was meant to conquer. Every week, we tell the stories of American engines, factories, machines, and industrial names that once taught the country what power sounded like and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in Dearborn, Michigan in 1968. In 1968, in Dearborn, Michigan, the Ford Motor Company was fighting a war it could not afford to lose. The battlefield was not just the dealership showroom, but the high-banked oval tracks of the American South. This was the absolute peak of the win-on Sunday, sell-on Monday era, an industrial philosophy that treated racing victories as direct advertising. When a manufacturer dominated at Daytona or Riverside, foot traffic increased at dealerships in Ohio, Texas, and California the very next morning. But Ford had a severe problem. Chrysler's 426 Hemi was tearing through the NASCAR circuit, establishing a terrifying dominance. The Hemi was a massive V8 with hemispherical combustion chambers that allowed for enormous valves and unmatched high RPM breathing. Ford's own racing engine at the time, the legendary 427 cubic inch FE series, had reached its absolute developmental ceiling. The 427 was a brilliant machine, but its block architecture simply could not be expanded any further. Chrysler was pulling away, and Ford's corporate pride and market share were on the line. The urgency deepened when Seaman Bunky Knudsen, a former General Motors executive, took over as president of Ford in early 1968. Knudsen was a fierce advocate for performance. He understood that in the American muscle car market, horsepower was not just a metric, it was a cultural identity. He immediately authorized a new, no-compromises racing engine project to dethrone the Hemi. The foundation for this new weapon would be Ford's massive 385 series engine family, specifically sized to 429 cubic inches. Displacement, the total volume swept by the pistons inside the cylinders, was not just a mathematical formula in a catalog. In late 1960s NASCAR, it was the brute force solution to pushing a heavy 2-ton steel car through the air at 190 miles per hour. The new 429 block was cast from high nickel iron, featuring 4-bolt main bearing caps to keep the heavy steel crankshaft from tearing itself out of the bottom of the engine under the immense stress of a 500-mile race. But engineering a monstrous racing engine was only half the battle. NASCAR did not allow purely experimental technology on the track. The sanctioning body operated under strict homologation rules. If Ford wanted to run the new 429 on Sunday, they had to prove it was a real production engine. The rulebook demanded that at least 500 units of the engine be sold to the general public, installed in factory street cars, and made available through standard American dealership networks. This regulation created a massive engineering and financial dilemma. An engine built to run flat out at 8,000 RPM for hours on a track is a fundamentally different machine than an engine built to idle at a stoplight in Chicago or start on a cold morning in Denver. The 500 street cars would need a factory warranty. They would need a service network. They would need mechanics at local Ford dealerships to understand how to tune and repair them. The promise of this new engine was so potent that it actually lured Richard Petty, the undisputed king of NASCAR and a lifelong Plymouth driver, over to Ford for the 1969 season. Ford had to deliver. To beat Chrysler, Ford's engineers designed enormous aluminum cylinder heads. The cylinder head, the upper part of the engine that helps seal the cylinders and contains the valves, was where the new Boss 429 made its incredible power. Instead of a true hemispherical chamber like Chrysler, Ford used a crescent-shaped combustion chamber, earning the engine the internal nickname Blue Crescent. The intake and exhaust ports were so massive that mechanics often joked you could drop a baseball through them. Because of the extreme cylinder pressures this design created, traditional head gaskets, the seal between the block and the cylinder head, were deemed too unreliable. Instead, Ford used individual copper O-rings to seal each cylinder, a technique pulled directly from high-end racing and aerospace. In a local Ford dealership service bay, this meant a standard mechanic was suddenly faced with aircraft-level assembly requirements. But the sheer physical size of those aluminum heads made the Boss 429 engine incredibly wide. It was wider than the 426 Hemi. It was wider than Ford's own 427. It was an absolute behemoth of iron and aluminum. Logically, Ford should have homologated the engine by putting it into the Ford Torino. The Torino was the aerodynamic mid-size car that Ford actually used in NASCAR competition. Dropping the massive 429 into the Torino's spacious engine bay would have been relatively straightforward. But Bunky Knudsen made a fateful marketing decision. He did not just want to win races, he wanted to elevate Ford's most famous product. He decreed that the new Boss 429 engine would be homologated not in the Torino, but in the Ford Mustang. The Mustang was a pony car, it was compact. Its engine bay was originally designed in the early 1960s to hold a small inline-six or a modest 289 cubic inch V8. When Ford's engineers tried to lower the new Boss 429 into a standard 1969 Mustang, the physical reality set in. The engine was nearly 2 inches wider than the space between the Mustang's shock towers. It was a hard, immovable physical conflict. The block, the main engine structure that holds the cylinders and major internal parts, simply could not clear the car's front suspension. Ford's own Rouge River assembly plant, a marvel of mass production, was entirely unequipped to deal with this. You cannot pause a moving assembly line that churns out a car every minute to take a torch and a hammer to a chassis. The mass production system that had defined American industry since Henry Ford could not handle the bespoke violence required to make the Boss 429 fit. To meet the 500-unit rule, Ford was forced to pull the 428 Cobra Jet Mustangs off their own assembly line. They would ship them to a specialty firm, Kar-Kraft, in Brighton, Michigan. There, away from the efficiency of the main factory, workers would manually cut, widen, and rebuild the front end of the Mustang just to swallow the massive aluminum heads. Ford had the engine they needed to win on Sunday. Now they had to figure out how to force it onto the American streets by Monday. The solution to Ford's packaging problem was located 50 miles away from the main Rouge assembly line, in the small town of Brighton, Michigan. The facility was called Kar-Kraft. It was not a traditional factory. It was a contracted skunk works, a specialized engineering firm that Ford had previously used to develop the Le Mans-winning GT40 race cars. Now Kar-Kraft was tasked with performing industrial surgery on mass-produced Mustangs just to satisfy a NASCAR rulebook. The process was painstakingly manual and violently mechanical. Partially assembled 1969 Mustangs, originally intended to be 428 Cobra Jets, were shipped without engines from Ford's Dearborn plant to Brighton. Once inside Kar-Kraft, the front suspension architecture was entirely re-engineered. Workers had to physically relocate the shock towers, the structural metal housings, in the engine bay that hold the front suspension springs and shock absorbers. By pushing them outward, they created a cavity just wide enough to swallow the massive 429 block. The front control arms were moved. To offset the massive iron and aluminum weight now sitting over the nose of the car, the heavy lead-acid battery was banished to the trunk. This was no longer American mass production. It was bespoke, expensive fabrication, and Ford was losing money on every single unit they built. But the financial cost was irrelevant. The homologation requirement was the only metric that mattered. At the center of this expensive chassis modification was the engine itself. The Boss 429 was a mechanical breakthrough for Ford's V8 program. The block was cast from heavy, high-nickel iron, but the true breakthrough was bolted on top. Massive aluminum cylinder heads. A cylinder head, the upper part of the engine that helps seal the cylinders and contains the valves, was traditionally made of heavy cast iron in American street cars. Ford chose aluminum for the Boss 429 to shed critical weight and to rapidly dissipate the extreme heat generated during a 500-mile superspeedway race. In an American dealership service bay, the sight of these gigantic, unpainted aluminum castings completely changed how mechanics viewed a standard Ford V8. Inside those aluminum heads was the blue crescent combustion chamber. Unlike the true hemispherical shape of Chrysler's Hemi, Ford's engineers designed a semi-hemispherical, crescent-shaped pocket. This allowed them to install valves so large they practically touched each other. These massive valves allowed enormous volumes of air and fuel to rush into the cylinder, giving the engine incredible breathing capability at 8,000 RPM. Inside the block, Ford utilized a forged steel crankshaft, the rotating heavy metal shaft that turns the downward motion of the pistons into rotational power, held in place by heavy-duty 4-bolt main bearing caps. The connecting rods, the thick steel arms linking the pistons to the crankshaft, were forged and secured with massive half-inch bolts. This bottom end was virtually indestructible, designed to withstand the brutal mechanical stress of running at wide-open throttle for hours. But in a street car commuting through Ohio or California, this level of internal over-engineering was almost absurd, because that high RPM breathing capability created a brutal paradox for the street cars being built in Brighton. NASCAR required the engine to be sold to the public, but Ford still had to provide a factory warranty, and the car still had to be drivable in standard American traffic. To make the street version survive daily driving, Ford had to intentionally choke its own masterpiece. They installed a mild hydraulic lifter camshaft, the internal shaft that controls exactly when and how far the engine's valves open. A racing camshaft is designed to keep the valves open long enough to swallow massive amounts of air at high speeds, but it makes an engine idle roughly and stall at stoplights. The mild street camshaft gave the Boss 429 a smooth idle, but it severely limited the engine's power below 4,000 RPM. On top of the engine sat a massive Holley 735 CFM carburetor, a mechanical device that mixes liquid gasoline with air before the mixture is pulled into the cylinders. While a 735 CFM carburetor was large for a standard street car, it was highly restrictive for a racing block of this displacement. Furthermore, Ford was forced to fit the engine with an emissions system, including a smog pump, to comply with the tightening federal air quality standards of 1969. The result was a pure racing engine trapped inside a street-legal cage. Ford officially rated the Boss 429 at 375 horsepower, a measurement of how quickly the engine can do work. Everyone in the Detroit automotive industry, every mechanic, and every dealership owner knew this number was a bureaucratic fiction. It was deliberately underrated to pacify American insurance companies who had begun charging exorbitant premiums on young drivers buying high-horsepower muscle cars. The true output of the engine, even in its restricted street form, was likely much higher. Yet the reality of the Boss 429 on the showroom floor was bizarre. Because the engine was so physically wide, it completely filled the modified Mustang engine bay. When a local mechanic opened the hood, the aluminum cylinder head sat nearly flush against the metal shock towers. A routine maintenance task, like changing the spark plugs, required special tools, double-jointed wrenches, and hours of frustrating labor. Because the engine produced such violent rotational force, Ford did not even offer an automatic transmission. Every Boss 429 was mandated to come with a heavy-duty 4-speed manual gearbox. The clutch pedal was notoriously heavy, requiring genuine physical effort to operate. Every Boss 429 that left the Kar-Kraft facility received a special badge of honor, a metal door tag stamped with a unique KK NASCAR sequence number. It was physical proof that this was not a normal Ford. It was an industrial loophole on wheels, a homologation special built purely to appease a sanctioning body in Daytona. The engineering breakthrough was complete. Ford had successfully manufactured 859 Boss 429 Mustangs for the 1969 model year, easily satisfying NASCAR's 500-unit minimum rule. The massive aluminum heads and crescent combustion chambers were now officially street legal, paving the way for the engine to be unleashed in the aerodynamic Torino on the high-banked ovals of the South. The machine was finally ready for the showroom, but the streets of 1969 were about to test a machine built only for a high-banked oval. By the spring of 1969, the Boss 429 Mustang began rolling off specialized transport trucks and onto the lots of local American Ford dealerships. It did not arrive like a standard passenger car. It arrived as an industrial halo, a massive mechanical flex from Ford's Dearborn Engineering division. At famous high-performance showrooms like Tasca Ford in East Providence, Rhode Island, or Galpin Ford in Southern California, the delivery of a Boss 9 was a genuine local event. The physical presence of the machine was intimidating. To feed the massive Holley carburetor, Ford had installed a gigantic, manually operated hood scoop, the largest functional air scoop ever fitted to a production Mustang up to that point. The front fenders were subtly rolled by the Kar-Kraft workers to clear heavy-duty 15-inch Magnum 500 wheels wrapped in thick Goodyear polyglass tires. Unlike the brightly colored, heavily striped muscle cars of the era, the exterior was almost entirely devoid of flashy graphics. There was just a small, understated Boss 429 decal on the front fenders. It looked less like a traditional hot rod and more like a piece of aerospace hardware temporarily parked on the street. The price tag reflected that industrial reality. A standard six-cylinder Mustang in 1969 could be purchased for around $2,800. The Boss 429 package alone added a staggering $200 to the price, often pushing the final window sticker well past $4,800. In an era when a brand new full-size family station wagon could be bought for $3,500, the Boss 429 was astronomically expensive. It was not a vehicle for the average high school teenager looking to go fast on a Saturday night. It was an executive's muscle car, bought by doctors, successful contractors, and hardcore racing loyalists who understood exactly what was hidden beneath the hood. In an America where an engine could decide whether a field was cut, a truck made its delivery, a boat left the dock, a generator carried a hospital through a storm, or a plane lifted from the runway, power was not an abstraction. It was iron, fuel, labor, heat, sound, repair, and trust. For the 859 buyers who took delivery of a Boss 429 in 1969, they were buying absolute mechanical supremacy. When a local gas station attendant or a small-town mechanic popped the hood, the visual impact of those gigantic, unpainted aluminum cylinder heads spanning nearly the entire width of the modified engine bay commanded instant silence. It looked as though someone had dropped a locomotive part into a pony car. The heavy four-speed manual transmission required genuine muscular effort to shift. To drive it was to operate a piece of heavy machinery, feeling the thick forged internal components vibrating through the floorboards. But the streetcar sitting in the dealership was only half of the glory. The entire reason the Kar-Kraft facility in Brighton was cutting Mustang shock towers and losing money on every single chassis was so that the Ford Racing division could unleash the unrestricted Boss 429 on the NASCAR circuit. While the street engines were being intentionally choked with mild camshafts and restrictive exhaust manifolds to satisfy warranties, the true racing engines were being shipped to legendary American racing builders. Down in Charlotte, North Carolina, the Holman Moody Racing Shop, Ford's primary factory racing contractor, was busy dropping the unrestricted Blue Crescent into the aerodynamic Ford Torino Talladega and Mercury Cyclone spoiler. On the high-banked ovals of the American South, the Boss 429 was finally allowed to breathe. The racing version of the engine utilized a specialized dry deck block, meaning there were no water passages between the engine block and the cylinder heads. Instead, coolant was routed through external hoses, and the cylinders were sealed with heavy-duty O-rings to handle the violent compression. Unshackled from federal emissions requirements and street-legal mufflers, the track-prepared Boss 429 produced a verified output approaching 600 horsepower. It was a completely different machine than the one sold in showrooms, capable of pulling a 2-ton stock car to nearly 200 miles per hour at the Daytona International Speedway. When the 1969 NASCAR Grand National season fully opened, The sheer mechanical arrogance of the Boss 429 project was instantly validated. The American stock car circuit was a brutal, unforgiving environment, where a single structural flaw in an engine block could end a 500-mile race in a cloud of white smoke and burning oil. But Ford's engineers had overbuilt the Blue Crescent to survive exactly that kind of violence. The racing version of the engine, unrestricted and bolted into the aerodynamic Ford Torino Talladega and Mercury Cyclone, Spoiler 2 was an absolute monster. The massive aluminum cylinder heads breathed effortlessly at extreme speeds. While the street cars were heavily restricted, the track engines were fitted with massive aluminum intake manifolds and aggressive racing camshafts. At the Daytona International Speedway and the newly built Alabama International Motor Speedway at Talladega, the Boss 429 did not sound like a traditional American V8. Running near 8,000 RPM, it produced a high-pitched, terrifying mechanical scream that echoed off the high-banked asphalt. The strategy engineered by Bunky Knudsen and the Ford executives in Dearborn worked perfectly. The lure of the new engine was so undeniably strong that it had convinced Richard Petty, the reigning king of NASCAR who had spent his entire career driving for Plymouth, to defect to the Blue Oval for the 1969 season. Petty drove a blue Ford Torino Talladega powered by the Boss 429, winning 10 races. Fellow Ford driver David Pearson was even more dominant, capturing 11 victories and winning the 1969 Grand National Championship. By the end of the year, Ford had won 26 races and easily claimed the manufacturer's championship, crushing Chrysler's Hemi in the process. This was the absolute zenith of Ford's total performance era. The company had already spent millions to beat Ferrari at Le Mans, and now they were spending millions to dominate the American South. The Boss 429 was the ultimate physical manifestation of corporate pride. It did not matter that Kar-Kraft was losing thousands of dollars on every single Mustang they modified in Brighton. It did not matter that the assembly process was inefficient, chaotic, and required manual metal cutting. The only metric that Dearborn cared about was the trophy on Sunday and the newspaper headlines on Monday. And for the American public, that racing glory transferred directly back to the dealership floor. Even though the 859 buyers of the 1969 Boss 429 Mustang knew their street cars were choked by restrictive carburetors, mild camshafts, and federal emissions equipment, they also knew exactly how to fix it. In garages, machine shops, and local drag strips from California to New York, American hot rodders immediately went to work unleashing the engine's true potential. They unbolted the factory smog pumps and threw them into the trash. They replaced the mild factory camshaft with aggressive, high-lift aftermarket profiles. They swapped out the restrictive exhaust manifolds for headers, tubular aftermarket exhaust systems designed to rapidly scavenge spent gases out of the engine, allowing the enormous cylinders to breathe. Once unshackled, a tuned Boss 429 Mustang was a violently fast machine. At local drag strips, it became a terrifying opponent. The extreme weight of the massive iron block over the front wheels made the car difficult to handle in a corner. But in a straight quarter-mile sprint, the sheer volume of air and fuel moving through those crescent-shaped combustion chambers produced overwhelming torque. The idol of a modified Boss 9, a deep, irregular, rhythmic thumping, became a warning signal in the American muscle car hierarchy. This was a time when the American automotive industry seemed invincible. Detroit was producing engines of staggering size and complexity, entirely unburdened by the realities of global fuel supplies or environmental constraint. A company like Ford was willing to redesign a chassis, outsource its production, and build a massive aluminum-headed racing engine just to satisfy a rulebook and settle a grudge with a rival. It was an era of boundless mechanical optimism, built on cheap gasoline, heavy iron, and the belief that any engineering problem could be solved with a larger displacement figure. The badge had found its believers, and the engine was winning its wars, but the industry had not yet shown the price of that kind of mechanical arrogance. The first crack in the Boss 429 empire did not happen in a corporate boardroom in Dearborn, and it did not happen in the pit lane at Daytona. It happened in the driver's seat of the streetcars, sitting at red lights in Los Angeles, Chicago, and Detroit. The buyers who had spent nearly $5,000 on the ultimate Ford muscle car were quickly discovering a harsh mechanical reality. The engine that was obliterating Chrysler's Hemi on the high-banked ovals was frustratingly compromised on the street. The massive intake ports in those aluminum cylinder heads were designed to flow air at 8,000 RPM. But at 2,000 RPM, cruising through a suburban neighborhood, the air velocity dropped. The engine bogged down. To get the 3,500-pound Mustang moving from a dead stop without stalling, the driver had to violently slip the heavy-duty clutch. This created an immediate nightmare for the American Ford dealership network. The service bays, accustomed to working on simple cast-iron 289 and 302 cubic-inch V8s, were suddenly inundated with Boss 429 Mustangs returning for warranty work. Clutches were burning out. The hydraulic lifter camshafts, installed to give the car a smooth idle for the street, were failing to deliver the low-end torque buyers expected. Worse still was the routine maintenance. Because the engine block and the massive aluminum heads consumed every available inch of the modified engine bay, simply changing the spark plugs became a masterclass in frustration. Mechanics at local dealerships had to use special double-jointed swivel sockets, cut their knuckles on the shock towers, and sometimes loosen the engine mounts just to lift the motor enough to reach the back cylinders. A standard tune-up on a normal Mustang took an hour. On a Boss 429, it could tie up a service bay for an entire afternoon. The service network, the dealers, mechanics, and parts suppliers that keep a machine running after purchase, began to view the car not as a halo product, but as a warranty liability. The company was already losing money on every single unit that rolled out of the Kar-Kraft facility in Brighton. The manual labor required to cut the shock towers, relocate the battery, and assemble the bespoke front suspension was an industrial anomaly. In the era of mass production, Henry Ford had taught the world how to build a car efficiently. The Boss 429 was the exact opposite, an inefficient, hand-built homologation special that existed entirely outside of Ford's standard manufacturing logic. This financial bleeding was tolerated in 1968 and early 1969 because the project had a powerful protector: Ford President Bunkie Knudsen. Knudsen believed that racing victories and sheer horsepower justified the manufacturing losses. But in September 1969, a massive shift in corporate power occurred. Henry Ford II, the grandson of the founder, abruptly fired Knudsen. The corporate umbrella that had shielded the expensive, money-losing Boss 429 program from the accountants evaporated overnight. With Knudsen gone, the executives in Dearborn began looking at the Kar-Kraft operation not as a racing triumph, but as a balance sheet disaster. The homologation rules had already been satisfied. Ford had built the required 500 units to legalize the engine for NASCAR. From a purely corporate perspective, there was absolutely no financial reason to keep building the streetcars. Simultaneously, a new and devastating force was reshaping the American automotive landscape: the insurance industry. For years, young American men had been walking into dealerships, signing a loan, and driving away in 400 horsepower machines with drum brakes and bias-ply tires. The inevitable result was a catastrophic rise in traffic fatalities and severe accidents. By 1970, insurance actuaries decided they had had enough. The insurance companies began applying massive surcharges to any car with a high-performance V8. Almost overnight, the cost to insure a Boss 429 Mustang exceeded the monthly loan payment to buy the car. It did not matter how fast the engine was or how many races it won on Sunday. If the buyer could not afford the insurance premium on Monday, the car would sit rotting on the dealership lot. The economics of American horsepower were being fundamentally rewritten by risk assessors sitting at desks in Hartford and New York. And beyond the insurance offices, an even larger existential threat was looming over Detroit. The federal government was preparing the Clean Air Act of 1970, which would mandate drastic reductions in tailpipe emissions. The era of the high-compression, heavy-breathing, unregulated V8 was effectively being outlawed. To meet the incoming emission standards, engines would need lower compression ratios, restrictive exhaust systems, and unleaded gasoline. The Blue Crescent engine, a machine entirely dependent on high compression and massive fuel flow, was a dinosaur looking at an incoming asteroid. The engine was surviving the track, but the world outside the high-banked oval was closing in on all sides. In early 1970, The executives in Dearborn faced a mathematical and regulatory impossibility. The incoming federal emissions standards were not just a suggestion, they were the new law of the American road. To clean up tailpipe exhaust, the government was pushing for the elimination of leaded gasoline. For the Boss 429, this was a death sentence. The engine's massive aluminum cylinder heads and crescent-shaped combustion chambers were engineered to operate at a high 10.5.1 compression ratio. That level of compression required high-octane, leaded fuel to prevent catastrophic pre-ignition, commonly known as engine knock, which could physically destroy the pistons. If Ford wanted to keep the Boss 429 street legal in the unleaded era, they would have to drastically lower the compression, the squeezing of the fuel mixture inside the cylinder, but lowering the compression would instantly castrate the engine's power, defeating the entire purpose of building a massive, expensive homologation special. At the same time, the corporate philosophy inside Ford was radically shifting. With Bunky Knudsen gone, Lee Iacocca took the reins as president. Iacocca was a brilliant product planner, but he was a pragmatist looking at a changing American market. He saw that the era of total performance was becoming a financial liability. The American public was beginning to worry about fuel economy and inflation. The future of the Ford Motor Company was not going to be built on an 8,000 RPM aluminum-headed racing block. It was going to be built on economical subcompact cars like the Ford Pinto. In late 1970, Ford made a stunning corporate announcement. They were officially withdrawing their factory financial backing from all motorsports. The multi-million-dollar racing budget that had funded the Le Mans victories and the NASCAR dominance was slashed to zero. Without the racing program to justify its existence, the Boss 429 streetcar had absolutely no reason to live. The financial losses at the Kar-Kraft facility in Brighton could no longer be hidden under a promotional budget. Ford abruptly pulled the plug. For the 1970 model year, only 4 1989 Boss 429 Mustangs were built. They received a few minor cosmetic updates in a mechanical solid lifter camshaft, but the writing was on the wall. By the end of 1970, the Brighton assembly line went silent. The manual cutting of shock towers ceased. Kar-Kraft itself, the specialized skunk works that had engineered Ford's greatest performance triumphs of the 1960s, was eventually shut down entirely. The decline of the engine out in the American landscape was just as rapid. By 1971, compression ratios across Detroit plummeted. By 1973, the OPEC oil embargo created massive fuel shortages and skyrocketing gas prices. The Boss 429, an engine that measured fuel economy in single digits, suddenly looked like a reckless artifact of a bygone era. Owners who had stretched their budgets to buy the nearly $5,000 car now found themselves unable to afford the insurance premiums and the gasoline required to drive it. The cars began to disappear from the streets. Dealership mechanics stopped seeing them in the service bays. Many were sold off cheap to drag racers who stripped the chassis, blew up the original high-nickel blocks on the quarter mile, and threw the irreplaceable aluminum cylinder heads into scrap bins when they cracked. Others were simply pushed to the back of suburban garages, covered with dusty tarps, and left to sit as the American automotive industry pivoted toward catalytic converters, low-horsepower V8s, and imported four-cylinder economy cars. The machine that had been built to conquer Daytona was defeated by a combination of insurance actuaries, clean air legislation, and corporate accounting. Detroit had proven it could build a racing engine without compromise, but it could not protect that engine from the changing reality of the American market. The engine still ran. The insurance premiums doubled. The unleaded pumps arrived. The warranty claims mounted. The factory doors in Brighton closed. The NASCAR rulebook shifted. The corporate money vanished. The badge remained on the fenders. The era of raw displacement was gone. The assembly lines were retooled. The homologation wars ended, and the engine was shelved. But iron and aluminum outlast corporate balance sheets. The Boss 429 engine, as a production reality, ceased to exist after December 1969, when the final 1970 models rolled out of Brighton. However, Ford did not completely abandon the underlying 385 series engine architecture. The heavy cast iron block, stripped of its exotic aluminum cylinder heads, crescent combustion chambers, and high RPM racing pedigree, would go on to live a long, utilitarian life in the American landscape. Bored and stroked out to 460 cubic inches, it became the workhorse motor for Ford F-250 pickup trucks, Econoline vans, heavy-duty farm equipment, and massive Lincoln Continentals throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Truck drivers and farmers trusted that block for its low-end torque and bulletproof bottom end, but that was a low-compression beast of burden. The true Blue Crescent, the high-strung racing machine built to shatter stock car records at Daytona, was dead. Today, the 1,358 total Boss 429 Mustangs produced across those 2 years have moved entirely out of the realm of transportation. They are no longer cars, they are a recognized American asset class. At major collector events like the Mecum and Barrett-Jackson auctions in Florida, Texas, and Arizona, a verified Boss 429 crosses the auction block not for thousands, but for hundreds of thousands of dollars. The best surviving examples, retaining their original Kar-Kraft NASCAR sequence tags on the driver's side door, routinely command prices exceeding $500,000. Some have even crossed the $1 million threshold. In high-end restoration shops across the country, mechanics and automotive historians spend years hunting down the exact original components that the first owners aggressively threw in the trash. An original Holley 735 CFM carburetor, a factory-correct smog pump, or an untouched cast-iron exhaust manifold, the very emissions and warranty equipment that choked the engine back in 1969, now costs an absolute fortune to acquire from specialty parts bins and swap meets. The preservation community treats the engine bay not as a mechanical space to be modified for speed, but as an archaeological site, demanding absolute historical accuracy down to the specific color of the paint on the valve covers and the correct chalk marks on the firewall. But this intense collector obsession must pass a critical test. This is not merely nostalgia for a faster, louder era of American highways. Nostalgia is cheap. A preserved Boss 429 sitting under the fluorescent lights of an American museum is a physical argument about a vanished industrial mindset. It proves that there was a brief, incredibly narrow window in American history where corporate ego overpowered corporate accounting. It is a 600-pound chunk of iron and aluminum that testifies to a moment when the Ford Motor Company was willing to butcher its own mass production assembly lines, outsource its labor, frustrate its dealership network, and intentionally lose money on every single unit sold just to settle a grudge on a racetrack. It shows us how American manufacturing once solved extreme engineering problems, not with software algorithms, battery efficiency, or wind tunnels, but with brute physical force, exotic metallurgy, and massive engine displacement. The physical infrastructure that birthed the machine is long gone. The Kar-Kraft facility in Brighton, Michigan, the specialized skunk works where blue-collar workers took cutting torches to Mustang shock towers, was declared bankrupt and shuttered in late 1970, just months after Ford officially withdrew its factory racing support. The building was sold off, eventually absorbed back into the anonymous industrial sprawl of the Midwest, leaving no trace of the automotive surgery that once happened on its floors. And the ultimate irony, the surprise footnote of the entire Boss 429 program, was written by NASCAR itself. Shortly after Ford spent millions of dollars engineering the engine and modifying the Mustangs to conquer the homologation rules, the sanctioning body decided that the cars had become far too fast and dangerously unstable. NASCAR changed the rulebook for 1971, placing severe displacement restrictions on the aerodynamic track cars. The massive engine built specifically to dominate the rulebook was effectively outlawed by the same rulebook before it could establish a lasting, multi-year racing dynasty. The Boss 429 represents the violent, spectacular end of a specific mechanical era. America did not stop needing power. It simply stopped needing that kind of power. The market moved relentlessly toward fuel efficiency, strict clean air regulations, computer-controlled fuel injection, and eventually the silent torque of electrification and hybrid systems. The modern automotive world is undeniably cleaner, faster, and infinitely more reliable. But it is also highly rational, governed by safety compliance, emissions limits, and strict profit margins. The absolute irrationality of cutting up a brand new car to fit an engine that was physically too large for it is an industrial gamble that will never be repeated. What vanished was not just a specific V8. It was a time when mechanical arrogance was considered a valid, necessary corporate strategy. Somewhere in a climate-controlled American restoration shop, a Bear Boss 429 block sits bolted to a heavy steel engine stand, the massive unpainted aluminum cylinder heads waiting to be installed, the copper O-rings laid out carefully on a workbench, preserving the heavy, complex, uncompromising reality of a machine that Detroit could only afford to build once. See you in the next one.